thinking was, the analysts were saying, I think quite rightly, that what the Russians would be trying to do is open up a new front in the north. So you then draw Ukrainians' reserves to defend in the north, and having pulled the reserves, you then attack elsewhere. The Russians have simply not managed to do that. So the kind of the follow-up attacks just haven't really come. So, we're in a situation now where the Kharkiv offensive seems to have, it hardly took any ground in real terms. And the Ukrainians now seem to kind of be slowly pushing them back. So go back to your original question. Lack of command quality right at the top, all the way through to just poor soldiers on the ground who aren't good enough and whose heart isn't in the fight.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, Major General Rupert Jones, who was previously the UK's most senior commander in Iraq and joint-led coalition forces against ISIS in Iraq. Rupert, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
James, delighted to be with you. Thank you.
To begin, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, General Budanov, says Western military aid is arriving in Ukraine now, but it's unlikely to arrive at a scale that will significantly impact the situation on the front line until mid to late July. From a logistical point of view, why does it take so long for military aid to be delivered and deployed?
Yeah, I think this is a really important statement. It actually dates from an interview about 10 days ago. So look, the comments are a little bit out of date, but they've only just been published in the last couple of days. So it is significant because it gives a real insight into that, whatever it was, $61 billion worth of aid and how it flows into Ukraine. I'll come back to that in a second. Why does it take so long? Well, the Americans made great store of the fact that as soon as the money was authorized, some initial aid flew immediately. But of course, it was really tokenistic. But the reality is that the military hardware is, incredibly, it's heavy. It takes time to move. It's got to be pulled out of warehouses. It's got to be sourced. This stuff isn't just sitting, ready to be used around the world. One of the things that the Ukraine conflict has brought into stark relief for, if you like, people who don't ordinarily focus on military matters is the fact that Western nations do not have large stockpiles anymore. We military professionals have always known this. We've been saying it for a very long time. Go back to the kind of post-Cold War peace dividend, if you like. Those stockpiles were written right down because stockpiles, firstly, smart munitions are extremely expensive, but secondly, stockpiles are expensive. And weapons, munitions have a shelf life. So you make them, they sit on a shelf and they're not used, and then they have to be used in training. So it's a very, very expensive game, and quite understandably, government, the taxpayer, doesn't like to see its money used in that way. But there is a price you pay because your stockpiles are essentially an insurance policy. So go back to your original question. The reality is that there are not, endless supplies of these munitions sitting in warehouses in the United States, waiting to be used. So that's part of the delay. Then it's the logistics and indeed the supporting bureaucracy that just takes time.
And when Budanov says it might be mid to late July that we see an impact on the front line, what do you think that impact will look like? How will it help the Ukrainians on the ground?
Yeah, well, he's already given a little bit of an insight because as part of that same interview, he made the point that Russian artillery advantage that had been in recent months about 7-1, by which we mean for every 7 shells the Russians fired at Ukraine, the Ukrainians were only able to fire 1 in return. You don't need to be a military professional to recognize that that's really bad news. You're just being outgunned all of the time. Budanov has said that already the flow of US aid has changed that ratio from 7-1 to 5-1. So begins to give you a pointer and highlights the degree to which the Ukrainians have just lacked munitions, they've lacked artillery shells to really take the fight to the Russians. So that's really important. But that's just munitions. We know there's also long-range weaponry. We can come back to that later. But then take ourselves all the way back to 2022, and the aid that was delayed through that first winter, and then the spring offensive that never really materialized in 2023. Why was that? It was because the material came too late. And again, you can't just take a piece of equipment and it becomes a piece of war. You've got to receive it, you've got to train on it, you've got to integrate it, you've got to have all the supplies. So from receiving a truck, an armored personnel carrier, whatever an artillery piece, whatever it might be, from it arriving at a dock, at an airport, for example, to it then being deployed on the battlefield as genuinely integrated military capability takes time. And again, this is the real calculus I think that's going on in Ukraine at the moment, is, Russia trying to use 2024 to decisive advantage. They're not achieving that so far. And Ukraine then lining up, okay, when will they be ready with all of this aid to then use it in a decisive way? They can deploy artillery shells readily, but the real hardware, the F-16s coming at some point, when does that all begin to give them, the full orchestra of war to go again and really begin to try and change the calculus on the battlefield?
And we'll come back to that point and when Ukraine may, for example, be able to launch a new counteroffensive in a moment. You said something really interesting there, Rupert, about the fact that Russia so far has not been able to use the advantages it's had in 2024 in terms of delayed Western military aid for Ukraine to a decisive advantage. Why is that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, it started to feel a little bit gloomy, back end of 23, early into 24, as the Ukrainian advantage, they throughout 23, although they weren't making decisive gains, it still felt as they just about had the advantage. They were making most of the plays, if you like, and slowly that ebbed away. And the Russians started to make some moves, and it felt as though they might just slowly almost overwhelm the Ukrainians through attrition, just slowly bludgeon their way forward. They haven't been able to do that. So why? Well, firstly, because the Ukrainians continue to be exceedingly resilient defenders. They just absorb this stuff. They're defending very well. They're making an absolute art of, the limited resources they've got. That's thing one. Thing two, that the Russian military throughout the hierarchy are simply not good enough. So, their soldiers on the ground, poorly trained, low morale, poor discipline. And they know that their chance of survival as individuals are very, very low. So their fighting prowess down on the battlefield is extremely low. That continues to be the case. But what they have also failed to do throughout the war is to really bring smart plays. Think of an American football team. Often it's about, I'm no expert, but it's often about the quality of the plays, the moves they deploy on the field. Russia has had no plays. All it has been able to draw out throughout the war, really from the end of month one, when the war started, the initial front line started to stabilize, is to bludgeon the Ukrainians, suffer enormous attrition in doing so, use huge amounts of artillery, but try and just bludgeon their way forward. They don't appear to have, and they have not appeared to have, any kind of really smart moves in their pocket. So when their attack came in Kharkiv in the north, whenever that was in May, the thinking was, the analysts were saying, I think quite rightly, that what the Russians would be trying to do is open up a new front in the north. So you then draw Ukrainians' reserves to defend in the north, and having pulled the reserves, you then attack elsewhere. It's a fairly classic military play. You try and get the defender moving in lots of different directions to block, and then somewhere along the line, the attacker finds a point of weakness, and they go through, and you overwhelm their defenses. A good ploy, fairly standard. It's quite hard to defend against. The Russians have simply not managed to do that. So the kind of the follow-up attacks just haven't really come. So we're in a situation now where the Kharkiv offensive seems to have, it hardly took any ground in real terms, and the Ukrainians now seem to kind of be slowly pushing them back. So go back to your original question: lack of command quality right at the top, all the way through to just poor soldiers on the ground whose who aren't good enough and whose heart isn't in the fight.
Well, that brings us on, I suppose, to what Ukraine could do to take advantage of the situation and potentially launch a counteroffensive. I mean, first of all, there's the question of when. Most people seem to think we're looking at 2025 until there's a realistic counteroffensive. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I always say with these things, none of us commentators have any inside track. The Ukrainians very wisely have tended to be quite cautious in what they've shared with the public when they have shared it. Sensibly, it hasn't always been, the facts. They've been using information and disinformation because they want surprise on the battlefield. So we're speculating. We're trying to join dots, but the dots would suggest that 2025, spring of 2025, would seem sensible because we know what happened in 2023. I've already discussed it today about how, when they didn't get the resources from Western nations until too late, they weren't able to pull it together into the full orchestra of war. I think the lesson they will have learned is that we've got to get all this aid. We've got to get ourselves in really good order, absorb, what Russia can throw at us through 2024, and then go in 2025. They don't appear to be on the cusp of ending now. We're in the height of summer. There's still, multiple months left of, if you like, of good weather. But it would feel as though that they're not losing significant train in 2024. So it doesn't feel as though they're under huge operational pressure to make an early move. So I would have thought they will hold till 2025. Again, there's a bit of politics, a bit of global politics, US election and other things. We might come back to what other politicians are saying outside of Ukraine, potentially unhelpfully. But it feels as though they've got a little bit of time on their hand. So, based on what I know, 2025 seems a reasonable bet at this stage.
And of course, what would be helpful for the Ukrainians is if they were able to use the rest of 2024 to hollow out some of Russia's military capabilities, in particular by striking targets inside Russia, military targets inside Russia. And obviously the US has removed some of the restrictions on that front, but not entirely. How much of a limitation is that, the fact that America is still placing restrictions on military targets that Ukraine is allowed to strike inside Russian territory?
Yeah, I don't think we should underestimate that. The exact wording is a little bit difficult to divine. You kind of read different statements. I'm sure there's a document that's been given to the Ukrainians telling them exactly what the requirement is. But essentially, in layman's terms, they're being allowed to strike with US weaponry into Russia against targets that are involved in or overtly preparing for attacks against Ukraine. So, if for sake of argument, a Russian artillery battery is engaged in firing into Ukraine, then that would be legitimate. But what it prevents you doing is striking into logistic supply depots, for example, striking headquarters, for example, striking deep into Russia, into the panoply of war that is long-term preparing to come into Ukraine. So it is a pretty significant restriction still. I personally find it pretty hard to justify, but it's the position America continues to take, and so President Zelensky has to run with that until he can persuade them otherwise. I think again, as and when we start getting into the grounds of major Ukrainian offensive operations, hopefully the F-16s coming online, I think the West has got to be very, very careful of leaving in place some of these restrictions, because we've seen what happens. The West is every bit as much to blame that nothing happened in 2023 as the Ukrainians are. And I think we could ask ourselves some pretty searching questions about how many more shackles we're going to leave in place when the Ukrainians go onto the offense again.
If you like learning about defence, history and global security, you can watch Superpowers on the Times Radio YouTube channel.
And this is what I can't get my head around. I mean, it is surely in the interests of Ukraine supporters in the West for Ukraine to win this war sooner rather than later. If you're President Biden sitting in the White House in an election year, if he can say in November, okay, even if all restrictions are removed, would be unlikely that Ukraine would have won the war by then. But if you can point to significant progress being made or a sense of optimism on the Ukrainian side compared to Russia, surely that would be in his interest. That would work. That would be better for him politically. So can you make sense of it at all, Rupert?
It's really hard to, isn't it? You go back in time. We understand, where some of these restrictions came from. Back in 2022 into 2023, do we provide tanks? Do we not? Do we provide fast jets? Do we not? It was all wrapped up in a concern amongst Western nations and in NATO about what was perceived to be potential to escalate. Where does Putin have some red lines? Where are those red lines? Are we inadvertently crossing those red lines? And that's where that long-standing debate came from. And over time, it became clear to leaders that Putin's threats of escalation were just threats. And never say never, but Putin hasn't really stepped up. He hasn't spread the conflict beyond Ukraine. And that is why decisions were taken about tanks, about long-range fires, about fast jets. So you have to assume that the American decision is still based somewhere around that wider escalation calculation. There may be, other discussions going on inside the State Department in Washington, inside the Department of Defense, inside the White House that is more nuanced than that. But as best as we can understand, it still seems to be a concern around that escalation calculus. I find that quite hard because, as you say, it is in everybody's interest for this war to progress at a good rate. Political will in all of our nations is probably the biggest threat that Zelensky faces, and so speed is of the essence, and Zelensky knows that.
Talking of political will, obviously support for Ukraine is a very live issue in the US presidential election. Here in the UK, there has been, until now, broadly speaking, cross-party support for funding Ukrainian military aid and standing steadfastly behind Ukraine. But we've had, in the last few days, some controversial comments by Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the Populist Reform UK party here in Britain, big ally of Donald Trump. And okay, he would argue he is behind Ukraine, but he made some very controversial comments saying that the expansion of NATO and the EU eastwards had provoked Russia into invading Ukraine. He's received a lot of criticism here in Britain for those comments. What is your reaction?
He deserves every ounce of criticism he receives. He's now, in his doubling down, in his little war of words with Boris Johnson, he's now saying, and oh, by the way, we need to have a peace conversation. Zelensky needs to come and talk peace. If I'm totally honest, I think Farage's comments are despicable because they say nothing about what is going on in the war. He is making those comments solely for UK domestic political gain. As a military person, I find that distasteful in the extreme. He's making political capital purely for his own edification to try and gain more votes for the Reform Party. He does real damage by doing so in Ukraine, in Russia. The loser in this is Ukraine, innocent Ukrainians, the Ukrainian armed forces. It emboldens Putin, and I find his words deeply distasteful because he has, he's not elected. He's making pure electoral capital at the Ukraine's expense as a military professional. I found that disgraceful, and furthermore, it displays his total lack of understanding of geopolitics. And if he thinks that somehow putting Putin to a negotiating table ends well for anybody, be it NATO, the West, Ukraine, he really needs to go and study his history books.
And it is something that Ukraine somehow always has to justify its existence and come up against, despite the fact it's a sovereign, independent nation. If it wants to be a member of the EU, if it wants to be a member of NATO, it is as justified in being so as France or Germany or wherever.
Absolutely right. And to be fair to Western leaders, they have been consistent about this, haven't they? The EU, EU have just, introduced another round of sanctions, and I think the kind of watchword that these global leaders are sticking to is what you just talked to. Ukraine is a sovereign state. If we believe the international rules-based system, then Ukraine has the absolute right to defend its territory, and not just its territory lost since 2022, but the territory that was lost in 2014. And President Zelensky continues to say that is the ultimate headmark for him. Now, whether he ever achieves that is a separate conversation, but he's absolutely legally right to say that is his objective. For me, as anybody who is kind of claiming otherwise, the second and third order implications of beginning to say, sovereignty doesn't really matter. I mean, that's a really dangerous conversation to have. We've just had the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Thank God there were world leaders and men and women who understood the importance of sovereignty, the importance of liberty, and fought for those things.
And to bring us back to our earlier conversation about Western military aid, I mean, if long-term, I was really struck, you said there, Rupert, that long-term, one of the big dangers for Ukraine is a sort of crumbling of political support for Ukraine in the West. Given that, is it not imperative for the West to double down on its military aid and potentially go, well, look, we don't want Ukraine to have a shortfall in 6 months' time. They might be starting to receive the latest delivery. We need to be doubling down, providing even more aid, providing more long-range ATACMS, allowing them to strike the Kerch Bridge, whatever it may be.
Absolutely right. So as and when, at some point this war will come to an end. Who knows how? In some kind of, it could be a peace settlement. It could be just facts on the ground stabilized, and it kind of slowly comes to a halt. Who knows? But the key for Ukraine is to be in as strong a military position as possible when the music stops. He who dominates events on the ground takes the spoils, so they've got to be in as strong a position as possible when that happens, which, as you say, plays to give the military aid, allow Ukrainian forces to get as a stronger position as they can. The peace conversation, of course, is interesting because President Zelensky last week held his peace summit. I think that was very, very important. Not everybody was there, but the mere fact that it happened was, I think, important because it's just beginning to, lay the pathway, allow those conversations to happen. But of course, President Putin, he's an arch wrecker. So his, before that peace summit, him putting out, almost an offer on the table for Ukraine. That offer was essentially total Ukrainian capitulation. But he's clever because people will go, apologists will go, the Farages of the world will go, well, look, President Putin's trying to bring this to an end. He's trying to do the right thing. And what is so frustrating is that people fall into that trap. They can't see Putin for who he is, what his track record is, and the game, and I use the word game advisedly, that he is playing.
I just wanted to ask you, Rupert, about some interesting reports in the Institute for the Study of War saying that the Kremlin is continuing efforts to recruit former Wagner mercenaries. It's passing a new bill, apparently, that's going to exempt many of those involved in the attempted mutiny of last year. And when you think about that, it does beg the question, is that a sign of Putin's desperation, that he's having to recruit people who a year ago were working towards overthrowing him?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. What was it, June 24th? So, we're a year and 2 days after Prigozhin's failed march on Moscow. And yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely is a sign of desperation, but we see those signs of desperation all over. So, we know he's short of fighters. To be fair to Prigozhin, the Wagner fighters were, more effective than many others. So you can see why Putin would want to bring those into the fold. Putin is in a desperate position. The International Criminal Court has just brought warrants against his old defence minister and his old chief defence. The EU continues to bring sanctions. Things are not going well for Putin in real terms. And so I think all these things are a sign of desperation. The fact that he's cozying up to North Korea, doesn't exactly bode well for where Putin is in the greater scheme of things. The fact that the attack in Dagestan 3 days ago, he tries to blame on Ukraine and NATO. I mean, it would appear to be the rantings of a lunatic, except of course it's not. It's very deliberate plays. It's very deliberate misinformation that in this global era of digital news, the news is omnipresent. Anybody can kind of make the news. A sizable minority will believe those sort of conspiracies. That it's not IS who did this. That it is somehow it's Ukraine. It's NATO. It plays into the Farage type comments of NATO provoking. It's all of that kind of conspiracy based version of news.
How would you assess Putin's position domestically, internally within Russia? I mean, just thinking back to that mutiny, as you say, literally just over a year ago, there was a lot of speculation that he could be sort of teetering in his position in the Kremlin. Since then, of course, he appears to have stabilised things. Russia have made some advances on the ground. He won, quote unquote, his re-election earlier this year. Are we maybe guilty of assuming he is more secure than he is in his position?
Yeah, it's so hard to tell, isn't it? One would hope that intelligence agencies have a better inside track, though penetrating, Putin's inner circle to really understand what's going on has always been hard. And I assume, so it's hard to know. And again, we and media commentators were speculating and trying to kind of read signals. But it does feel as though he is more secure than he was a year ago. Even at the time of Prigozhin's uprising, most people were saying slightly careful what you wish for, because if Putin did fall, what would happen internally in Moscow? Who would take his place? Would there be some kind of internal bloodletting? So caution. He certainly appears to be more secure than he was, but it's very hard to tell. He's got rid of two of his great loyalists, as I mentioned earlier, Shoigu and Gerasimov, his defense ministers and chief defense. They've gone. But he's a great survivor, isn't he? So given the UK current political betting scandals, I sure wouldn't be betting on Putin going or staying.
Major General Rupert Jones, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today on Frontline.
Likewise, James. Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.